March 23, 1945, west bank of the Rhine near Wesel. 02 in 11 frost clung to the reeds like powdered glass. Breath hung white over rifle muzzles. Lieutenant Claire Whitaker crouched beside a hooded searchlight, gloved fingers on the elevation wheel, eyes on a sky the color of wet slate. "On my mark," she whispered, voice steady as a level. 50 yards forward, Sergeant Joe Marquez lay flat behind a flood bank, counting the slow seconds before men drown in their heads. Engineers waited with treadway pins in their teeth. A wireman, Eddie Klein, kissed a St. Metal through wool. Whitaker tipped the mirror, finding cloud. 2 degrees up, she said. A fuse hissed. The first star shell rose, a coal becoming a sun. Whitaker snapped the hood aside. The beam struck the low ceiling and spilled, milk-white everywhere, turning night into a pale morning no clock could explain. On the far bank, MG-42s hesitated. "Bring the morning," Whitaker said. Autumn 1944 bled into winter on rivers whose names tasted like metal. Maas, Roer, then the big one waiting like a black knife. The Rhine. Night became the enemy's ally. It hid steel teeth in hedgerows and turned water into a rumor with current. Patrols crossed in 2s and 3s, and too many failed to come back as the year turned. German doctrine prized the hours before dawn. Fallschirmjäger and Volksgrenadiers learned to live there, low, patient, and cruelly efficient. They rehearsed infiltration in dry creek beds, memorized the rhythms of American sentries, and laid trip flares where no one could reach them without a prayer and a wire cutter. Their range cards were neat and unforgiving, flood bank notches, ferry ramps, willow clumps that tripped silhouettes into certainty. An MG-42 didn't need daylight to do arithmetic. It only needed a sound to count. On the West Bank, American battalions learned a different math, the cost of guessing wrong in the dark. Engineers would creep to the water with folded treadway bays, feeling each step like a rosary. A single flare could erase a week's planning. Mortars walked the river's skin. Wiremen paid in yards and seconds, laying lifelines through mud that pulled boots the way grief pulls sleep. The weather helped the killers. Low cloud clamped the sky. Frost rhymed reeds to razors and ate the dexterity from glove fingers. Sound behaved treacherously. Wind shoved the crack of a rifle sideways, and an honest halt whispered from a foxhole could sail into a trench 2 bends downstream. Radios sulked. Batteries died young. Even the river seemed partisan, thawing only enough to make men colder. The men who worked the dark adapted or broke. Sergeant Joe Marquez of the 29th Infantry Division had started the war believing night belonged to ghosts and luck. By the rower he knew better. Night belonged to whoever prepared harder. He trained his squad to treat the hour before dawn as a craft. Socks dry by rotation, helmets taped to kill shine, cigarettes cupped, never shared with wind. He forbade hero silhouettes, no man stood to check a rumor. You crouched, you listened, you learned. Still he hated that hour. Good men disappeared into it as if swallowed by a quiet animal. Captain Hal Abrams' combat engineers carried a slide rule in his breast pocket and a superstition under his tongue. Bridges live or die in minutes, he said. He had the minutes tallied, how long to float a first bay, to pin a second, to anchor a far shore cable. He also had the names of men who had tried and failed, written in pencil on a card he never showed. The card got heavier every crossing. Corporal Eddie Klein was a lineman because he was small, fast, and could coax a radio to behave by looking at it with the right kind of pleading. What scared him wasn't bullets. It was water. Rivers dream in black, and he hated them for it. But he went where wire must go, forward, across, and up. Because if the line didn't hold, the bridge didn't hold, and if the bridge didn't hold, boys drowned in the dark. Rumors traveled faster than orders in those months. A British trick from Italy and Normandy had a new name on American lips: Artificial Moonlight. Angling searchlights into low cloud to paint the landscape with a dim, even glow. Not a spotlight, never a hard beam that shouted, "Here we are," but a spill that gave the good guys edges and took the bad guys' nerve. It wasn't just lights either. Artillery could lay staircases of star shells, one fading as another bloomed so no gap swallowed a patrol. Smoke could be used backward, as a curtain behind you so the enemy saw glow and guessed wrong about distance. It was a system, not a trick. Like all systems, it had to be rehearsed until hands knew it without eyes. Enter Lieutenant Claire Whitaker, 110th Anti-Aircraft Searchlight Detachment, drafted from a physics classroom where she had taught freshmen how to make light behave. The Army needed hands to build suns on demand. She obliged. She had the kind of mind that loved angles and the kind of courage that never looked like a speech. She learned the machines and weather that bounced wrenches off numb knuckles. She learned the river's moods from engineers who swore at it like an old rival. She learned infantry's fear by listening in silence while Marquez's boys cleaned their rifles and didn't talk about the last patrol. Early March brought a plan with teeth. Allied command wanted crossings from Nijmegen to Oppenheim. Wesel would be a hinge. The British would punch with commandos and bombers. Americans would throw bridges across the ruins before the dust settled. That demanded a window in the night where death blinked first. Whitaker's detachment received the order no searchlight crew expects. You will turn on in combat at time of our choosing. Every manual warned that lights drew fire like hymns draw believers. She signed anyway. So did her crew, farm boys who knew weather, mechanics who knew patience, and one lineman who hated water. They spent a week hunting cloud, measuring ceiling with the careful blasphemy of men trying to argue with God. Too low and the glow blinded friendlies. Too high and beams vanished into a heaven that wasn't listening. They rehearsed on a flood meadow with burlap screens and chalked angles on the housings. They timed star shells so no second went black between one bloom and the next. They practiced silence after ignition. No one shouted when the field turned white. You let the light work first. On the far bank, German machine gunners adjusted ear and hand to the old darkness. A black river, a familiar map, a habit of killing. They expected to own the hour before dawn, which is why 0211 mattered. Because the first job of a new idea is to change what an enemy believes he knows. Whitaker designed the dawn like an engineer designs a bridge. Load, span, failure points. Light, unlike steel, has moods. She mapped them anyway. First the ceiling. A searchlight beam at 84 inches diameter leaves the lamp house and travels uselessly unless it finds a low cloud to kiss. Too low a ceiling, under 800 feet, and the spill blooms into glare and throws men's shadows forward like targets. Too high, over 2,000, and the beam disappears into black, a prayer that goes unanswered. They needed a lid between 1,000 and 1,600 feet, thick enough to diffuse, thin enough not to drink the power. Every hour on the night before, Whitaker sent a weather kite with paper telltales. The kite came back smelling of cold river and diesel. Its ribbon told her the sky would hold second the angle. Lights facing the enemy made silhouettes. Lights angled up and back toward the friendly bank, painted the ground with milk and left faces in half shadow. She chalked AZ 020-060 arcs on the housings and EL +111D to +115D on elevation gears. A grease pencil mark on each mirror let a gunner dial the cloud kiss by touch alone. No spears, she told her crew. No hard beams. We spill, we do not stab. Third, the ladder. Star shells would build the staircase across time that the searchlights built across space. Gunnery plotted a daisy chain. One shell at 1,000 meters burn out at 25 seconds. The next blooming at 23, so 2 seconds overlap. Then another in the next grid and another. So the river wore a necklace of slow suns. Fuse timings lived on the FO's wrist like a second pulse. If a shell died early, smoke crews filled with backlit haze so no sudden dark betrayed men halfway from bank to bank. Risk lived in the margins. Light revealed. It reveals you as surely as it reveals the man trying to kill you. So Abrams and Marquez rehearsed what not to do. No man stood on a skyline. Helmets low, bayonets taped. No white rags, no polished buckles, no hands waving in the glow. Fire discipline flipped. First minutes under milk had one rule. Rifles talk only when they must. Let the enemy blink first. When they did, counter battery would speak in full sentences. Radio nets braided 3 trades into one conversation. Infantry, engineers, searchlight. Klein drew the net diagram in pencil on a ration box. Able, Inf, to Charlie, Eng on one freck, lights monitoring both, and FO net in his other ear. He ran a doubled line to every lamp, primary wire and a shadow wire strung 30 feet apart so one hit wouldn't blind a sector. He staked the lines with low pegs he could find blind. He rehearsed the crawl to fix a break with his eyes shut and his mouth shut, so teeth would not chatter on copper. Enemy expectation was a weapon too. For months, German crews had timed their machine gun belts to the rhythm of Black River and nervous Americans. Now that rhythm would betray them. When white glow turned reed silver, a gunner accustomed to guessing at shapes would see too much and hesitate. When star shells bloomed as planned, a mortar leader, trained to count 3 shells and then walk the bracket, would find his old arithmetic stumbling. When they fired anyway, they'd line their tracers against a sky that made their lanes legible to men like Marquez. Countermeasures had counters. German flak might try to blind the beams, so Whitaker's crew kept spare reflectors within arm's reach, gloves cut for speed. If the far bank threw smoke across its floodplain to steal the glow, Charlie Company's smoke would answer behind the engineers to keep sightlines honest on the near bank. If a sniper cracked a mirror, the light simply moved 2 degrees and the beam returned as if the sky itself had shrugged. At 0140 they ran the dry drill one last time. "Hoods on, beams cold," the FO whispered the fuse cadence. Whitaker's hand found the elevation wheel, eyes closed. Marquez's squad raised and lowered heads to feel how shadows fell across cheeks. Abrams tapped his watch through the motions of pinning a bay in 15 seconds that would take 40 under fire. Klein lay next to his paired wires and rehearsed the crawl to a break and the splicing of copper with River in his boots. The final brief cut the plan down to its truth. "Dark owns us until we choose otherwise," Whitaker said softly. "At 0211 we choose." On the far bank, MG-42s waited to write their usual sentence across water. On the west bank, 3 trades waited to change the grammar. The last thing the men noted before the order was not a sound. It was the way the low cloud settled like a lid set by a careful hand. And if the design of a dawn was set, what mattered next was who had the nerve to throw the switch. Blunt Claire Whitaker had the habit of counting under her breath when she touched metal. 1. Too steady, like a teacher keeping time for a nervous class. She wore her cap low, braid tucked, pencil tucked lower. The crew didn't salute much around her. Respect came by gravity. She listened before deciding, and once decided, she didn't look back. The men called her Lamp Boss with a grin they didn't show anyone else. Sergeant Joe Marquez carried a rosary knot in his pocket and a map in his head. He knew the smell of floodbank mud from the scent alone. He briefed his squad like a father and fought like a bricklayer, straight, plumb, and forever fixing the last mistake. In the minute before anything started, he always said the same sentence. "We'll win the first 30 seconds and the rest will follow. CPL." Eddie Klein felt cold faster than other men and hit it better. He could tie a Western Union splice in the dark with teeth clenched, then hum a half-tune to keep his hands at the right speed. He feared the river but never told it so. When he lay with wire across his chest and felt the current as a pressure in dirt, he imagined his kid brother listening on the other end, and that was enough. Hal Abrams liked rules because bridges fell down when you didn't. He wrote timings on his cuff and checked them against his heartbeat. He was the kind of officer who said please to privates and no to colonels with the same tone. Men trusted him because he never pretended minutes were longer than they were. Together, they were a strange choir, light infantry, wire, steel, tuning to the same pitch. The plan turned night into a tool chest, starshell ladders, fire direction chained illumination like rungs. Gun crews popped shells on a cadence that overlapped by 2 seconds, so there was never a black seam for panic to crawl through. The first rung sat high over the near bank, softening shadows where men staged. The second painted the river's throat. The third laid a pale lane over the far floodplain, where MG nests looked like molehills at noon. Searchlight cones. Lamps aimed back toward friendly ground to bounce light off low cloud. No beams stabbing the enemy, only a pooled glow that made silhouettes shallow and edges readable. Each cone overlapped its neighbor by a sliver, so if a mirror died, the others swallowed its job without a gap. "No spears," Whitaker repeated. "We spill, smoke is curtain." Instead of hiding movement, smoke sat behind the engineers, a gauze that blurred the West Bank skyline. To the enemy eye, distance went slippery. To the friendly eye, the task stayed clear. When wind misbehaved, the smoke crews moved with it, painting strokes of white where sightlines needed protection. Shadow math. Marquez drilled his squad on reading their own silhouettes, knees up through longer shadows than bellies. Rifle barrels telegraphed position. Bayonets were taped dull. He assigned shadow posts. One man watched the glow's effect on their cover and called micro-adjustments. 2 inches left, chin down, so no skull perched on a ridge like a gift. Counterburst discipline. The first enemy belts would likely walk the old habits. Marquez forbade nervous returns. We don't answer rhythm. We break it. When tracers stitched air, his bar waited for the breath between third and fourth and cut across, not with the line, a habit learned the hard way on the rower. Decoy ripples. Engineers pushed empty assault boats out midstream at irregular intervals. In Artificial Moonlight, a black ripple looked like men. Germans spent belts on ghosts while the real bridge parts drifted lower in the pale lane, nudged by poles and curses. Redundancy in approach. 2 treadway bays staged side by side, one sacrificial to absorb first hits, the other to ride the moment the guns blinked. Abrams drilled the swap until men could exchange roles without naming them. Each man knew 2 jobs: a pin man could pole, a pole man could lash, because in the dark you worked with who survived, not who was assigned. Searchlights are temperamental suns. Whitaker taught the mechanism like scripture, elevation and azimuth. On the lamp house, grease pencil arcs marked AZ, Aero 22, Digger 058 Ds and EL, 112.5 Ds as the sweet spot for that night's ceiling. Gunners felt for a tiny burr on the wheel, a filed nick so they could set angle by touch under fire. An extra half-degree up washed faces out. An extra downcast long dangerous shadows. Precision here saved lives later. Mirror swaps. Each crew pre-loosened the mirror clamps 1/4 turn to speed a swap. Spare reflectors lay on sandbags with corners padded in canvas to stop clink. If a sniper chipped a face, hands moved without orders: hood down, clamp, lift, seat, clamp, hood up. 8 seconds, practiced until it sounded like one word. Fuse ladders. FO wrists carried wax tape with burn times. Mecha tube shells burning 25-27 seconds at set height, Mecha third at 31-33. They cross-loaded types to avoid a single failure blanking a lane. If wind began eating seconds faster than forecast, the FO shifted from 23-second overlap to 20, shaving risk while fuel lasted. Wire in pairs. Klein ran primary and shadow lines 30 feet apart, staked low. Where the ground forced crossing, he dipped one cable in shallow trench to avoid a single machine gun sweep cutting both. He greased joints with Vaseline against river damp, and wrapped splices in friction tape he warmed in his armpit, so it would bite better in frost. Sound discipline. Cloth wrapped every metal thing that might click. Helmet nets tucked straps. Bridge pins rode in rags. Even the lamp hoods wore felt on hinge stops. Under Artificial Moonlight, sound betrayed more than shape. A single clang could redraw a map. Fall back dark. If cloud thinned, lamps throttled down to keep the glow even. If the ceiling blew out, the crew shuddered and handed the stage to the starshell ladder alone. No half-light stutters, either dawn or dark by design. The worst enemy was inconsistency. All of it braided into a single principle: control the first minute. Not dominate control. Give scared hands work with edges. Give shooters geometry instead of superstition. Give the river a reason to pretend it's morning. By 02:08, breath steamed. Gloves flexed. Watches kissed their marks. The human, the tactical, and the technical had tuned to the same hum. The only thing left to add was courage and a switch. Leadership in the dark had a different flavor. It wasn't shouting or speeches. It was rhythm. Captain Hal Abrams led by seconds. He carried a stopwatch instead of a pistol, thumb resting on the stem. The first bridge bay would take 42 seconds to float out, 36 more to pin, 40 to lash. He knew the intervals better than his pulse. When the shooting started, he didn't bark orders. He counted aloud, steady as a metronome, and his men worked to that beat. Panic couldn't fit between the numbers. Lieutenant Claire Whitaker led by quiet precision. She had learned that fear entered through noise, so she made silence her command voice. The crew copied her calm without realizing it. Lamp 1 ready. Lamp 2 mark. Lamp 3 hold for cloud. Her sentences were always the same shape, short, factual, final. Her authority didn't rise. It settled. Sergeant Joe Marquez led by motion. Men watched him because he never flinched. When tracers crossed, he was already moving, adjusting his line by inches, whispering corrections without breaking eye contact. 2 down, crawl 3 feet. That's shadow. He led from a knee, not a pedestal. Leadership that lived on the same cold ground as the rest of them. Even Corporal Eddie Klein, barely 20, became a kind of leader for 500 yards of copper. No one told him how to splice under fire. He taught others by doing it wrong, then doing it right until they memorized the pattern. He was the kind of soldier who never spoke in briefings, yet when wire died, the whole crossing waited for his hands to work. Leadership wasn't rank that night, it was competence that glowed like its own light. On the far bank, darkness had been doctrine. The German defenders, Volksgrenadiers mixed with veteran machine gunners, had rehearsed this script for months. They knew the rhythm of American caution, the way footsteps slowed after a flare, the 30-second silence before a probing burst, the pause before engineers waited. They called it the lull before stupidity. Their night training was brutal and exact. MG-42 crews set belts by touch, oiling links with bacon grease to keep them supple and cold. Riflemen worked with sight hoods off, trusting hearing more than eyes. Their officers believed the night belonged to discipline, not courage. They had maps, pre-sighted arcs, and trip flares laid like veins across the floodplain. When artificial light arrived, it broke the ritual. The low ceiling that had protected them became a mirror, flooding their trenches with pale glare. Camouflage nets meant for blackness turned into nets of shadow. Machine gunners blinked, mistook reflection for movement, and wasted belts on reeds that looked like men. One officer later wrote in his diary, "The sky turned milk. I thought it was gas. We fired until our barrels smoked, but nothing answered. Panic didn't come loud. It came confused. Command nets overloaded with reports that made no sense. Enemy attack at dawn. Flares continuous. Visibility impossible. They didn't know the light was deliberate, controlled, and practiced. They thought the Americans had captured the morning. The irony was cruel. In trying to fight the light, they revealed themselves. Snipers adjusting optics flashed their scopes. Riflemen changing position cut black silhouettes against glowing fog. Mortars whose tubes flared orange became bright dots for counter-battery maps. The night that had once been their ally turned traitor in seconds. What happened on the Rhine that night wasn't just tactics. It was philosophy with voltage. For 6 years, the war had worshipped darkness. Every front had its predators. U-boats in Atlantic black, bombers over cities dimmed to avoid detection, soldiers crawling in the hour when God stopped watching. Darkness became the language of fear and advantage. It was anonymous, merciless, and fair to no one. The Americans chose to rewrite that. They decided that control, even artificial, improvised, fragile control, was worth the risk of exposure. To turn night into day was to announce, we no longer fear the unseen. We define it, but the light wasn't arrogant. It was gentle, almost pastoral. It didn't blind. It revealed just enough to give frightened men edges and distance. It didn't seek glory, it sought clarity. Soldiers later described the glow as like walking through a dream where the sun had forgotten how to rise but tried anyway. There's an argument buried in every battlefield between fear and understanding. That night the light won, not because it killed better, but because it allowed men to see what they were doing while they did it. It replaced superstition with geometry, panic with timing, chance with design. It gave war for a few hours the dignity of comprehension. Marquez would later write in a letter home, "The light was white like church candles. We could see faces. You can't hate a face as easily as a shadow." For Whitaker, it was something else. Her notebook from that night held a single line beneath her weather notes. "We borrowed morning." And it worked. And for Abrams, the engineer, it proved that order could survive chaos if someone built the frame steady enough. The war had been a long argument between what man destroys and what he can still create. The searchlights, the star shells, and the pale reflection off the Rhine argued quietly for creation. By 0210, the theory was built. The human hands were ready. The enemy was waiting. The sky, low and thick, held its breath. One order remained: switch on. And with that click, the story would leave rehearsal and enter history. Levin Whitaker's gloved thumb slid the hood lever. Lamp 1 breathed, an animal waking behind steel. The beam climbed, found cloud, and dissolved into milk. Lamp 2 kissed the same ceiling, 5 degrees offset. Lamp 3 waited on her nod, hood half cocked like a held breath. The first star shell rose from the far battery, fuse hissing like a fuse in a child's dream. It burst high and wide, not a flare but a floating morning. Glow found reed and ice, drew a soft outline around men who'd been shapes moments before. The river lost its teeth. On the far bank, an MG-42 rattled a reflex, short and mean. Its tracer stitched nothing. The lane it drew hung visible in the glow, a red seam pointing back at its own nest. "Hold," Marquez whispered to his squad. Hands tightened on rifles, then eased. They had rehearsed this, let the enemy write first. 2-2, 12, lamp 3, Whitaker said, and the third beam lifted, just enough. The cones overlapped to make a single white hush over the west bank. In the glow, engineers uncoiled like muscle, remembering how to move. Abrams raised his hand, lowered it, and the first treadway bay slid forward on shoulders and curses. Men waded to their thighs, boots finding purchase as if the river had agreed to stand still. Klein's headset popped once. "Able to Charlie net live. Shadow wire track good." He slid along his paired lines on elbows, keeping his belly low, feeling the copper hum faintly with the weight of voices. A second star shell climbed on the FO's cadence, blooming before the first could fade. No seam of dark, no stumble. The air itself kept time. 13, the enemy adjusted. Mortars coughed from behind the far flood bank. The first round went long, a splash beneath the searchlit sky. The second walked short, as doctrine says, and died in mud that glowed the color of old bone. The third groped for center and found only reeds. The glow changed the arithmetic. Every muzzle flash wrote a coordinate. The FO murmured into his handset, and a destroyer offshore answered with a single punctuation mark. One shell, exact, then silence. Not a duel, an edit. Marquez scanned to the right. A black knot near a willow stump resolved into a helmet's line. 2 o'clock low, he breathed. His barman didn't surge. He eased the barrel left and waited for the MG's breath. On the fourth bead spray of tracer, the bar cut perpendicular, a saw-through ribbon. The MG hiccuped, coughed, fell quiet. Up, Marquez said softly, and the squad inched to their next shadow. So 214 had cracked like a snapped icicle whipped past lamp 2. The mirror winked, then starred. Sniper. The beam smeared and tried to lance. Whitaker's gunner flinched. She didn't. Hood down. Mirror swap, she said, voice level. Hands moved. Hood, clamp, lift, seat, clamp, hood. 8 seconds. The sky dimmed, then breathed again. Lamp 2 returned as if the shot had missed history. A second crack hunted lamp 1 close. Shift 2 degrees port, Whitaker told the gunner, already turning the elevation wheel herself. The glow slid a fraction, just enough to wash faces flat again. No spears, she reminded. Not for him. For the fear trying to enter the crew through their ears. 15 Abrams Bay hit water. Men knee-deep found the river's push, compensated by leaning into the new morning. Pins clanked, muffled by rags. A man slipped, cursed, stood, and nobody looked at him, because the light let them keep working instead of imagining his death. The second bay followed, a lover's embrace to the first, overlapping just enough to live together or die together. 36, Abrams counted, eyes on the watch's thin hand. 37, pin. The hammer sounds were small, careful, like tapping a nail into a church pew. Klein felt a tremor through the shadow wire, an impact somewhere ahead. He rolled to a knee, checked continuity on a pocket buzzer. The tone steadied. "Lines hold," he told air that felt like it could hear. On the far bank, a flare sputtered from a panicked squad leader's hand and hung under the artificial sky like a second sun that didn't know its place. In its rude light, 3 Germans moved trenches. The glow betrayed the motion, turned it into a lesson. Marquez measured angles with his eye, tapped 2 men, and the squad wrote a short sentence of fire that ended the movement and the need to discuss it. A runner splashed up. "Word from battalion, keep it clean." "No hero shots," he said, already breathing for his next sprint. "Tell them we like boring," Marquez replied. 2, Sonny Whitaker felt the ceiling thin and nudge. The light softened on the rightmost cone. "Lamp 3 throttled down 2 points," she said. The gunner complied and the spill evened, the glow returning to its original hush. She sent a glance to lamp 2. Its mirror wore a hairline crack but held. "We're good," she said, mostly to herself, partly to the sky. The FO's voice came soft but sure. "Staircase intact. Burn times holding. Next lift in 20. 2, 18 Abrams men dragged the far shore anchor into the current. The river pushed. They pushed back. In the glow, they looked like figures from a story older than war. Men hauling mourning to a stubborn bank. The anchor kissed mud, bit, and held. 40, Abrams counted. 41. Lash. Straps whined, teeth closed, and the first bay stopped being brave and started being useful. On the far bank, a machine gunner tried to relearn night inside a false day. He fired wild. The tracers drew himself a red noose. Counterburst found the knot and pulled. Bridge will live, Abrams said, not loudly. He didn't have to. Whitaker watched the beams breathe, the cones overlap, the river turn honest. She allowed herself one sentence that wasn't in any manual. "We borrowed morning," she whispered, "and it paid us back." The minute hand touched its next mark. The first act had held. The night was no longer sovereign. What came next would decide if the glow could survive contact with a counterattack, and if the wire could speak through chaos without stuttering. 2:20. The counterattack came not as thunder but as a ripple. A German platoon, blinded by its own doctrine, tried to cross the glare. Dark uniforms stitched by white light, boots slapping mud that no longer hid them. They'd been trained to move toward gunfire, to use flashes as beacons. But now there were no beacon, only an even, inescapable day. Every motion betrayed itself. Every shadow they created pointed like an arrow back to them. Marquez's squad saw the shimmer first. "Movement, left bank," hissed his scout. "Wait for contrast," Marquez said. The glow deepened as a shell burst somewhere high, throwing drifting dust into the beam. The Germans emerged like figures walking through fogged glass, now. 3 M1s barked once each, not panic but punctuation. The first man folded, the others ducked, but the white world offered them nowhere to vanish. Night, their oldest ally, had turned informant. 2. Mortars woke. Round after round groped the waterline. One landed near lamp 1. Shrapnel thudded against the steel casing. The hood dented, the light quivered but held. "Status," Whitaker called. "Glass intact," her gunner shouted back. Whitaker's jaw clenched. She knew if one mirror cracked fully, the spill would die, and the symmetry of the whole plan would unravel. She reached for the elevation crank herself, eyes flicking from cloud to horizon. "Hold reflection. Hold." She found the exact degree where glare turned back into glow. "Lock it," she said softly. "We don't blink." Beside her, Eddie Klein crawled over to check the wire. A fragment had nicked the outer insulation. He stripped the wound bare with his knife, twisted the copper tight, then wrapped it in tape slick with mud. "Line steady," he yelled, breath fogging the air. His fingers burned, but the tone in his earpiece returned, a tiny hum of civilization amid chaos. 25, across the river, Abrams' engineers hit a snag. One bay had drifted 10 feet offline. The current tugged it downstream, threatening to spin the entire structure. "Cut the rope or lose it all," shouted a corporal. "Not yet," Abrams said. He scanned the glow, every ripple visible, every mistake exposed. He saw the anchor chain snared around a half-submerged stump. "Pole 2, port side, down 3 feet. They heaved. Metal screeched. The stump tore free, bobbed once, and was gone. The bridge realigned itself like a breath drawn straight. Abrams exhaled, counting seconds under his breath again. 27 German shells found the rhythm of the light and tried to kill it. They aimed for the beams themselves, thinking to collapse the illusion. 2 rounds burst short, throwing wet earth into the cones. For an instant, the world dimmed. Whitaker didn't wait for orders. "Lamp 3, flare compensation, half step up." Her crew cranked. The beam climbed, found cleaner cloud, and rebounded stronger. The battlefield glowed again, softer but even. The enemy's gunners, blind in their own smoke, had just painted their own positions for counter-battery. Within seconds, American artillery corrected fire. The thunder that followed didn't just silence guns, it silenced a theory. 30 now the glow stretched from reed to ruin. It wasn't a trick anymore. It was daylight made by hands. The men crossing could see each other's faces. Dirt and fear, yes, but also awe. Marquez led his squad down the embankment toward the bridgehead. "Eyes low, steps small," he said, though the path was clearer than any they'd ever seen at night. Klein, crawling behind them with wire spools, caught his reflection in the pale water, a ghost crawling under artificial dawn. For a moment he thought of his brother back home, waking to a different kind of morning, and almost smiled. On the far bank, German survivors fell back to a tree line. A machine gunner tried to drag his weapon to new cover, but the light betrayed every motion. A bullet found him. His assistant looked skyward, confused, muttering a prayer to a god who seemed to have left the light on. "Counterattack breaking," came the FO's voice. "Bridge half secured." Whitaker allowed herself a breath. "Maintain beams," she said, almost tenderly. Her hands trembled now that precision was no longer needed. 35. Then came a last test. A shell struck close enough to knock Lamp 2's generator cold. The beam flickered, dimmed, and died. For a moment, a dark pocket opened, a gap, a weakness. "Back up!" Whitaker snapped. Klein rolled, pulled the auxiliary line, and threw the lever. The engine coughed once, then roared. When the light returned, it came brighter than before, dazzling white against the thinning cloud. Marquez looked up at it, blinking tears. "That's it," he murmured. "That's the dawn." 2:38. The glow began to fade only when the first true sun threatened the horizon. Abrams walked the length of the new bridge. Mud, sweat light streaking his coat, and whispered, "You're born," behind him. Whitaker's crew covered their lamps one by one, the way priests snuff candles after Mass. The last hood clicked shut, sealing the night they had unmade. By Oro 3 Wanyar, the river was crossed, the far bank held, and reports filtered through command nets. Enemy resistance collapsing. Casualties minimal, but in every account, one phrase repeated: "Artificial dawn successful." For the men who lived it, that phrase meant something larger. The night had changed sides. At first light, clipboards came out like salves. Officers wrote numbers to soothe nerves. Bridges counted in bays became bridges counted in tons per hour. Patrols that once returned in halves now returned in wholes. Dry ink belied what breath could now do. Radios carried ordinary words again: water, coffee, relief, instead of grid squares and apologies. The first ambulance crossed, whining softly. A chaplain followed, and someone on the near bank laughed because he tripped on a pin and swore like a corporal. Abrams walked the deck of his bridge in a slow audit, tapping pins with the back of a gloved knuckle. Thock, 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 each clean note a promise kept. He had a pencil behind his ear, but for once it had nothing new to write. At midspan he stopped, put both hands flat to the steel, and felt a vibration that wasn't fear. It was traffic. Marquez's squad hunkered in a shallow, smoking trench on the far bank. They shared a canteen gone warm and tasted cordite and iron on their tongues. "Ever think you'd see your own boots at this hour?" one man asked. No one answered. They were listening to a noise they'd never heard at night on a river. The rumble of trucks making plans possible. Whitaker sat on a coil of cable beside lamp 2. Her crew dozed in ragdoll poses, mouths open, palms black with mirror grit. She turned her notebook to the weather page and drew a thin line between two numbers, ceiling at ignition, ceiling at fade. Under it she wrote Cloud Cooperative. Then, almost as an afterthought, crew braver than manuals assume. Klein finished dressing the last nicked junction and stood, back aching. He tugged the Saint medal from his shirt and looked at it without kissing it. For the first time, the river in front of him didn't look like a mouth, it looked like a road. On the German side, medics lifted 3 wounded from shallow pits washed pale by the residual glow. One, a young machine gunner with soot on his cheeks, kept looking at the sky, trying to understand how morning had come without the sun. He asked for water in a voice that hadn't learned to be an enemy's voice yet. He got it. Maps were redrawn by noon. Arrows jogged where the bridge wanted them to jog. The crossing point earned a name it would never shed. Dawn Bridge, written in grease pencil on dashboards and then inked on orders. The weather shifted by afternoon. Clouds thinned. Wind chased the last smoke scraps inland. The lamps sat quiet under their covers like animals that had done the hard pull and were content to sleep. And for a few hours, while clerks typed and officers briefed and engineers pretended their knots would hold forever, the men who had brought the dawn let themselves breathe the kind of breath that doesn't taste like frost or fear. It tasted like coffee. Someone finally made some. The method traveled faster than rumors usually do. By April, field notes from 3 Corps carried the same phrase in their margins: "Use moonlight if cloud." Staff officers began to say it like a verb: "Moonlight the avenue of approach, moonlight the ford." It sounded almost gentle. What it meant was fewer men stumbling into holes they'd never see again. Doctrine caught up in pieces. A bulletin tucked between mine-clearing updates and bridge load ratings laid out simple rules. Lights angled back, beams diffused, star shells overlapped, smoke for background, not concealment, radios braided, no hero silhouettes. The line for credit read, "Adapted from field practice by mixed units, Lower Rhine, March 1945. Names were spare. Results weren't. Whitaker's detachment rotated to a different sector. She carried her notebook like a reliquary, angles, timings, weather, a coffee ring brown as the river. When she briefed a new crew, she didn't mention courage. She spoke about calibration, rhythm, and how to treat fear like a current you cross with measured steps. A private once asked if she was scared when the mirror cracked under sniper fire. She said, "Of course. I just didn't give fear the microphone." Marquez's squad picked up a replacement or two and kept moving east. Rivers shrank to streams as the German line broke. He never forgot the night the sky obeyed, though. In a letter home he wrote, "We had a borrowed morning. We gave it back." He enclosed a pressed reed from the West Bank, lightened by the beams until it looked like paper. Abrams received a commendation that mispronounced his name and spelled out the tonnage his bridge carried the first 12 hours, numbers hefty enough to make a colonel smile. He tacked the paper inside a tent pole and went back to counting pins anyway. Bridges live by maintenance more than medals. He was content with that religion. Klein found that the river had lost its voice in his dreams. It no longer whispered about boots sinking or hands slipping. When he woke, he reached instinctively for the paired wires, a habit turned comfort. He let himself imagine his brother standing on a porch one morning in a world without blackout curtains, squinting at a sun that needed no help. And the enemy? Prisoners spoke quietly about that night for months. Some said the Americans had invented a new weapon, a sky gas that made men foolish. Others said the clouds had chosen a side. One diary recovered from a trench near the far bank had a single line: "We fought the light and lost." The rest of the page was empty save for mud and a fingerprint. The bridge earned its name on maps and in mouths. Dawn Bridge appeared on after-action reports, then in a few newspaper paragraphs packed between celebrity marriages and ration news. Families read the word without understanding what it meant. That for once in a murderous season, men could see what they were doing and live long enough to do it again. Weeks later, Whitaker stood alone by a lamp at dusk, covers on, wires coiled, the war already leaning toward surrender and silence. She looked at the low sky and felt that old teacher's urge to explain. Instead, she wrote a last note on the back page of her book: "Light is a choice." Then she closed it and handed the choice back to the weather. Not every night could be saved. Not every river could be argued into a road. But that one could. And because it could, others would. What stayed lit wasn't just the floodplain of a cold river in March. It was a small certainty, brought by hands, timed by breath, protected by nerve. That darkness is not law. It is only a habit. And habits can be broken. History often records the noon of wars: flags on roofs, signatures on tables, parades that forget the mud. What it rarely remembers are the minutes before dawn when fear and skill argue in whispers. The night by the Rhine belonged to fear for a long time. Then a handful of hands decided otherwise and taught a sky to cooperate. Artificial dawn was never only technology, it was temperament. The courage to risk being seen so that others could see. The restraint to let light speak first. The discipline to turn seconds into shelter. It proved that clarity can be an act of mercy. That when men recognize faces instead of shadows, they fire less wildly and build more precisely. It proved that invention is not a miracle but a habit, practiced under frost and pressure until the habit holds. For the enemy, that pale glow felt like blasphemy. For the men beneath it, it felt like permission. To cross, to work, to live through the hour that used to take them. In a season obsessed with destruction, someone engineered a way to add comprehension. That mattered. The lamps are silent now. The bridge is long gone. The river wears only its own light. But there remains a truth that outlived both cloud and cordite. Darkness is not sovereign. It is a condition awaiting a decision. If you listen at the right time in the right field, you can almost hear the old sequence, the hiss of a fuse, the breath of a lamp, the even voice counting seconds, and a river yielding to a morning borrowed on purpose and paid back in full. Subscribe for more true stories that remind us of what it means to be human, even in the darkest of times.